South Carolina, 1944. In a small execution chamber at the state penitentiary, a boy barely taller than 5 feet is led toward the electric chair. His wrists tremble as guards tighten the heavy leather straps meant for a grown man. They struggle to secure them around his thin arms. His feet dangle above the floor, so they place a stack of books beneath him just to make him reach the seat. The boy's name is George Stinney Jr. He is only 14 years old. Minutes earlier, George had whispered prayers, asking God for forgiveness and mercy. Witnesses say his lips quivered as he cried out for his mother, a mother who wasn't allowed to be there, who wasn't even permitted a final goodbye. At 7:30 in the evening, the switch was pulled. Electricity surged through George's fragile body. The mask covering his face slipped off, revealing tears rolling down his cheeks as he took his final breath. George was the youngest person ever executed in the United States in the 20th century. But here's what makes this case even more haunting. There was no physical evidence, no reliable confession, no fair trial. And decades later, a judge would declare that George Stinney had been wrongfully convicted. This is not just a story of a murder trial. It is a story of a child sacrificed to fear, racism, and injustice. A child whose name will become a symbol of America's darkest failures. To understand George Stinney's story, we must first understand a world he lived in. The year was 1944. World War II was still raging overseas. But in the small mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, life revolved around the lumber industry. It was a town divided, quite literally. White families lived on one side of the railroad tracks, black families on the other. Segregation was not just a law. It was a way of life, enforced through fear, custom, and violence. George Stinney Jr. was the son of a poor black sawmill worker. At just 14 years old, George was small for his age, barely 90 pounds and just over 5 feet tall. Despite his size, he was bright, curious, and protective of his younger siblings. His world was narrow, defined by school, church, and chores around the family's modest home. But across those railroad tracks, there was another world entirely, the world of Alcolu's white residents. They lived in larger homes, with better schools, better resources, and the full protection of the law. The divisions weren't only economic. They were racial lines drawn with iron precision. In this world, the word of a white person carried absolute authority. The voice of a black child, no matter how innocent, could be silenced in an instant. This tension simmered daily in Alcolu, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite it. That spark came on March 23, 1944, when 2 young white girls went missing. Betty June Binnicker was 11 years old, full of energy, known for her bright smile. With her that day was 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, her friend and constant companion. The 2 girls set off on their bicycles, laughing and talking, riding through the dusty roads of Alcolu. At one point, the girls crossed paths with George and his little sister, Catherine, who were tending to their family's cow near the edge of their property. Betty June and Mary Emma stopped to ask if the children knew where they could find maypops, a type of wild passion fruit. George and Catherine pointed them in the right direction. It was a simple, innocent exchange, but it would be the last time the girls were seen alive. By nightfall, when the girls hadn't returned home, their families began to worry. Search parties were organized. Neighbors combed through the woods, calling out their names. The tension in the small town grew heavier with each passing hour. The next morning, the bodies of Betty June and Mary Emma were found in a ditch just a few hundred yards from the Stinney home. Both had been brutally beaten, their skulls crushed by a blunt object. The town of Alcolu exploded in fear and fury, and within hours, suspicion fell not on an adult, not on a stranger, but on a 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. March 23, 1944. What began as an ordinary spring day in Alcolu quickly descended into tragedy. After Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames didn't return home, neighbors and family members grew frantic. The search began late that evening, but it wasn't until the next morning that the horror was uncovered. Just off a narrow dirt path, in a shallow ditch lined with brush, the 2 girls were found. Their bicycles were tossed carelessly nearby. The scene told a story of sudden, brutal violence. Both Betty June and Mary Emma had suffered devastating blows to the head. The The medical examiner would later conclude they had been struck repeatedly with a heavy, blunt object, likely something like a railroad spike or a piece of iron. The town was gripped with shock. In 1940 South Carolina, news traveled fast, carried by whispers and shouts across segregated neighborhoods. The image of two young white girls murdered so close to home set Alcolu ablaze with fear and with anger. Almost immediately, attention turned to George Stinney Jr. Why George? The answer lies not in evidence, but in circumstance. George and his sister Catherine were among the last people known to have seen the girls alive. That small fact, an innocent exchange about maypops, was twisted into suspicion. The fragile line between truth and prejudice collapsed in an instant. Within hours, deputies arrived at the Stinney home. George was pulled from his family, handcuffed, and taken away. He had no idea that his life, which had barely begun, was already over. There was no investigation of other suspects, no careful collection of evidence, no time given to grief or thought. The town wanted answers, and the authorities wanted someone to blame. And in Alcolu, in 1944, a poor black child was the easiest target. The day after the bodies of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were discovered, law enforcement descended on the Stinney home. George Stinney Jr., just 14 years old, was arrested on suspicion of murder. His younger sister Catherine cried as deputies took her brother away. Their parents, terrified of what was happening, were given no chance to intervene. Within hours, the entire Stinney family was forced out of town under threat of mob violence. They fled with nothing, leaving George behind, alone. From the very beginning, George's rights were stripped away. He was interrogated by white officers without a lawyer, without his parents, without even the presence of a sympathetic adult. No official record exists of what was said in that room. There was no written confession, no signed statement. All that survives is the word of the deputies, who claimed George admitted to the murders. But how reliable was that? Imagine the scene. A small, frightened boy, barely 90 pounds, surrounded by intimidating adults with badges and guns. He would have known that his life was in danger. He would have understood, even at 14, the deadly power of the racial hierarchy in 1940 South Carolina. Under those circumstances, any words he might have spoken cannot be trusted. The so-called confession was never documented, never examined in court, and never cross-examined by a defense. Yet it was enough. Enough to brand George as guilty in the eyes of the public. Enough to justify moving forward with a rushed trial. Enough to seal his fate before it had even been argued. From the moment of his arrest, George Stinney was no longer seen as a child. In the eyes of the system, he was treated as a criminal, a monster, a scapegoat. And with his family driven from Alcolu, George was left utterly alone. A 14-year-old boy with no protection, no advocate, and no chance. On April 24, 1944, just 84 days after the deaths of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, George Stinney Jr. was brought before the court. The trial lasted a single day. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for just 10 minutes before delivering their verdict. Guilty of murder with no recommendation for mercy. George's appointed defense attorney was a tax lawyer who had never tried a capital case before. By every historical account, he mounted almost no defense. He failed to challenge the reliability of George's alleged confession, failed to call a single witness in George's defense, and presented no evidence whatsoever to establish his innocence. Witnesses for the prosecution testified that George had confessed, though again, no written record of such a confession was ever produced. No physical evidence linked George to the crime. There was no blood, no weapon, no forensic proof of any kind. Yet in a courtroom filled with tension, anger, and the unspoken threat of mob violence, the jury didn't hesitate. 10 minutes of discussion was all it took to decide George Stinney's fate. When the verdict was read, George sat silent. Some accounts say he didn't fully understand what had just happened. He was a child, staring into a system designed to condemn him from the start. The judge sentenced him to death in the electric chair. At just 14 years old, George Stinney became the youngest person in modern American history to receive such a sentence. There would be no appeal, no second chance, no pause to consider the possibility of innocence. The machinery of justice, twisted by prejudice and fear, was moving forward, and in less than 3 months, it would end a boy's life. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after the murders, George Stinney Jr. was led to the death chamber at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He was 14 years old. He stood only 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed just over 90 pounds. The electric chair was built for grown men, and the straps hung loose around his small frame. Guards struggled to secure him, using a Bible as a booster seat to raise his tiny body high enough for the electrodes. As the leather mask was placed over his face, it slipped. His head was simply too small for the equipment designed for adults. Witnesses later recalled the haunting image, George's terrified eyes visible beneath the oversized mask. At 7:30 p.m., the first surge of electricity was sent through his body. His frail form convulsed violently. The mask slipped again, exposing his tear-streaked face. 2 more jolts followed. Minutes later, George Stinney Jr. was declared dead. He was 14 years old, the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. Outside the prison, the case faded quickly from public memory. But within his community, the horror of what had been done never disappeared. The questions remained. Was George truly guilty? Or had South Carolina executed an innocent child? For decades, his family carried the unbearable weight of that day, knowing George never had a chance to prove his innocence. In the days after George Stinney Jr.'s execution, life in Alcolu, South Carolina, returned to its quiet routines, at least on the surface. But for the black community, and especially for George's family, nothing would ever be the same. His parents and siblings, forced to flee town under threats of violence, carried a memory of his death for the rest of their lives. They spoke of him often, describing George not as a monster, but as a child who loved to draw, who dreamed of simple things, who never got the chance to grow up. For decades, the case lay buried in silence. No appeal, no retrial, no acknowledgement from the state of what had happened. But whispers persisted. Historians, journalists, and civil rights advocates began to question conviction. How could a child be sentenced to death after a one-day trial, with no defense witnesses and no physical evidence? The image of George's tiny frame strapped into a chair built for grown men became a symbol of racial injustice in America. It was not just about one boy, but about a system that had failed him from the very start. By the early 2000s, calls for justice grew louder. Legal experts revisited the case, highlighting glaring errors. Witnesses who had lived in Alcolu at the time came forward, some admitting that George had never been capable of such a crime. In 2014, 70 years after his execution, a South Carolina judge reopened the case. After carefully reviewing the records, testimonies, and circumstances, the court reached the conclusion that George's family had always known. George Stinney Jr. had not been given a fair trial. His conviction was vacated. For his surviving family, it was both a moment of relief and heartbreak. The truth had finally been recognized, but it came far too late to save a 14-year-old boy from the electric chair. George's name was cleared, but his story remains one of the most haunting reminders of how deeply injustice can scar a nation. George Stinney Jr.'s story did not end in that South Carolina courtroom. His wrongful execution became a painful symbol, one that continues to echo across America's justice system. Legal scholars point to his case as a textbook example of how prejudice, poverty, and fear can warp the very foundations of justice. With no physical evidence, no proper defense, and a rushed trial, the state of South Carolina killed a boy who never stood a chance. Civil rights leaders and historians now teach George's case as a cautionary tale. Law schools dissect it, activists invoke his name, and artists memorialize him in paintings, plays, and films. His face, young, frightened, and far too innocent for crime he was accused of, has become a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. Even the courts changed. Cases like George's pushed judges and lawmakers to demand stricter protections for minors, ensuring that children cannot be so easily swept into machinery of capital punishment. Today, it is unthinkable that a 14-year-old could be executed in the United States. That change is George's silent legacy. But beyond the law, his story continues to stir hearts. It forces us to ask hard questions. How many others have been silenced before their innocence was ever heard? How many families still carry wounds that no court ruling can heal? George Stinney Jr. was not just a victim of 1944. He is a victim of a system that, even today, demands vigilance, accountability, and courage to challenge injustice. And while his conviction was overturned in 2014, the larger truth remains. A boy lost his life to a crime he may never have committed, and his story stands as a warning we must never forget.